We are going to continue our study this morning of the post-exilic prophets. And if you weren't sure where we're at, we're in Zechariah chapter 4 this morning. We're in the midst of a series of visions that Zechariah has given. These are represented in roughly the first 6 chapters of the book of Zechariah. So we're in the midst of those particular visions. And before we get started, I've asked David if he would lead us in a prayer before we begin our study.
Our Father, we thank you for this very beautiful morning, for the opportunity we now have to study more from your word. We pray that you will be the church this morning to grace our study, and that you will help each of us listen that we better understand your word. We pray for all those that are not able to be here this morning. We pray that you will watch over them, allow them to come back as soon as possible, if you will. We pray now that you will with us in our study together. In Jesus' name.
Amen. Thank you, David. So as I mentioned, we're in chapter 4. We closed last week by just reading this chapter. We had enough time to read it, but we really didn't have time to start into studying it. So we get to reread it again this week. We're going to read the whole chapter because in this particular case, this is one entire vision. So we're going to read the chapter and then we'll come back and take points from it. So in Zechariah chapter 4, "And the angel who talked with me came again and woke me, like a man who is awakened out of sleep. And he said to me, 'What do you see?' I said, 'I see, and behold, a lampstand all of gold, with a bowl on top of it, and 7 lamps on it, with 7 lips on each of the lamps that are on the top of it. And there are 2 olive trees by it, one on the right of the bowl, and the other on its left. And I said to the angel who talked with me, 'What are these, my Lord?' Then the angel who talked with me answered and said to me, 'Do you not know what these are?' I said, 'No, my Lord.' Then he said to me, 'This is the word of the Lord to Zerubbabel. Not by might, nor by power, but by my spirit, says the Lord of hosts. Who are you, O great mountains? Before Zerubbabel you shall become a plain, and he shall bring forward the top stone amid shouts of grace, grace to it.' Then the word of the Lord came to me, saying, 'The hands of Zerubbabel have laid the foundation of this house. His hands also shall complete it. Then you will know that the Lord of hosts has sent me to you. For whoever has despised the day of small things shall rejoice, and shall see the plumb line in the hand of Zerubbabel. These 7 are the eyes of the Lord, which range throughout the whole earth.' Then I said to him, 'What are these 2 olive trees on the right and left of the lampstand?' And a second time I answered and said to him, 'What are these 2 branches of the olive trees, which are beside the 2 golden pipes, from which the golden oil is poured out?' He said to me, 'Do you not know what these are?' I said, 'No, my Lord.' Then he said, 'These are the 2 anointed ones who stand by the Lord of the whole earth.'" So here we have some deeper imagery, right? We've started into some visions that have some interesting vision to them, imagery to them. And this is another vision that, again, has great imagery to it. So if we go back to verse 1. So our lesson today is going to address the 5th of the 8 visions that were presented in these 6 chapters. They're visions that are given to Zechariah and recorded for us. These visions are to convey particular messages, and in this case, their meanings. Sometimes a vision is kind of self-explanatory, right? But we've talked about the fact that we commend Zechariah here. He's not an overly proud man, and he's not afraid to say, "I'm not sure I understand what you're trying to tell me with this vision. Please explain it." So we often get explanations. If you're anything like me, some of the explanations we get don't help clear it up nearly as much as we'd like, right? It's a little less fuzzy, but we'd really like a hard answer that says, this is exactly what I mean. If that's what we needed, then that's what we would have been given. Maybe the whole point is to make us think about this. If everybody just spoon feeds us everything, do we spend time working on it ourselves? So perhaps part of the reasoning is to make us work a little harder ourselves, get involved, reading the Word. Visions are subject to interpretation. It's easy enough to apply them in error. Even when it's not symbolic things like these visions. You know, have you ever read about the studies they do of people that witness, say, an accident? And if you had 4 different witnesses and you got their response from it, you could easily come away with 4 very different descriptions of that same event. It's a matter of perspective. We all interpret things based on our own personal experiences, don't we? So therefore, again, I think it's very important that Zechariah recognizes that he wants someone to explain this to him. The challenges we face here are not unique to Old Testament writings. Peter recognized this when he wrote, in 2 Peter 3:16, he was speaking about the challenges some people had with Paul's writings. Paul sometimes went into some very deep things, and people had challenging times understanding exactly what Paul meant sometimes. Peter had written, his letters contain some things that are hard to understand, which ignorant and unstable people distort, as they do the other scriptures, to their own destruction. And I wrote here that Zechariah, and hopefully us, don't want to be among those who incorrectly interpret these visions because we weren't willing to ask. And I noted here, if you're Zechariah, are you starting to feel a little overwhelmed by this series of visions? This is a lot to take in a short period of time. I think maybe that accounts for his idea of one who is awakened out of a sleep. You ever get so much information shared to you that you just kind of get that blank stare and you're not aware of anything that's around you because you're trying to process all this, right? So maybe that's the idea here. You know, get your attention, wake up. I got something else to show you here. All right, we'll move on to verse 2. The angel asked Zechariah, "What do you see?" Now, at first, Zechariah describes what he sees, doesn't he? Do you think that's really the question that the angel was asking? It may have been. Also, it may have been, what do you get from this image? The angel's looking at the image as well. Now, maybe he's asking him to describe it because he wants to see how observant he's being about it. On the other hand, maybe what he's asking them is, what do you think this means? Zechariah takes it the first way. He just gives a physical description of what he sees. Various translations provide different mental images based on the interpretations that you use of certain words, maybe the slight differences that came from different manuscripts that they worked from. I found the one, even though it's not what I read to you out of the ESV, I found the description out of the King James probably the most natural for me to grasp a hold of. I'm going to read that for you out of the King James. And he said to me, "What seest thou?" And I said, "I have looked, and behold, a candlestick all of gold, with a bowl on top of it, and his 7 lamps thereon, and 7 pipes to the 7 lamps which are upon the top thereof." So when we think about, they both have the bowl. That's easy enough to understand. There's a bowl filled with oil on top, right? So in these days of Zechariah, is there electricity? Of course not. How about candles? Were candles common? It's a little different than what we think of. They were more like we would think of as being oil lamps, right? Rather than, say, a traditional candle with a wax and a wick. So the idea here is you're going to have a lampstand with 7 lamps on it that are going to function each like a small oil lamp. You need to provide oil, don't you? That's what the bowl is for. And it has a means to carry oil straight from the bowl to each of the lamps to keep them replenished. So no one has to physically intervene to move oil from the bowl to the individual lamps. Seems easy enough, right? All right. So as we get to the period, say during the Exodus from Egypt, and God gives Moses the description of all the things to be in the temple, right? We have lamps there, do we not? Lampstands. How did those bowls of oil get refilled, or how did those lamps get refilled? Was it magical? Was it supernatural? No. Different Levites had different jobs, and among those jobs was to keep those filled so that the lamps continued to burn when they should. This is a different situation. No one's going to have to replenish this lamp. It takes care of itself. The real challenge becomes, how do you fill the bowl on the top? We understand the bowl feeding the individual lamps. How do you get that bowl on top filled up? We're going to learn that here in verse 12. So that's a spoiler alert. If you weren't paying attention while I was reading, now you're confused and you don't know the answer and everybody else around you does. Or I just gave it away and told you it's in verse 12, and you're going to jump back there real quick and read verse 12 so you understand right along with everybody else. Move on to verse 3. It says there are 2 olive trees by it, one on each side of it. So the second important aspect of this vision is the presence of 2 olive trees, one on each side. The oil that's used in the lampstand from the tabernacle that we just talked about in Exodus was very carefully processed olive oil. That's what they burnt in the lamps. Well, isn't that interesting? What do we have here? What kind of tree? An olive tree. Commentators have varying interpretations of what the 2 trees mean. So I'm going to give you 2 that are fairly popular beliefs. I don't necessarily agree with them, but I'm not a scholar either. The first one is that the trees represents Zerubbabel and Joshua, the 2 leaders of this group of people. But I think I find that really challenging, because if Zerubbabel is one of those trees, then we're being told when we get to verse 6 that he's talking to himself, because there's a message coming through this whole process, and it's going to Zerubbabel. Doesn't seem very practical that Zerubbabel would be delivering a message to himself that he didn't already know. The second is that they represent the offices of the king and the high priest. I find that challenging here, because to include a king, if this is God presenting the vision to them, who was supposed to be the king of the Jewish people? Who was the first person we call king of the Jewish people? Saul, right? Did they really need a physical human king? They had the most excellent king that any people could ask for. They had God himself as a king. So it seems odd to me that God would present to them that something terribly important to them is going to represent a physical king here. Again, I find that challenging. So to me, the most practical explanation is the tree represents God's communication to his people. We might think of that in one sense as the 2 covenants that we're going to see exposed. Again, think about this for yourself. I'm not telling you this is what it means. But as I look at this, I think of the 2 covenants. We have the old covenant that was established with Moses. We have the new covenant that's established with Christ. And we're told that these things represent the light of God going out into the world. How did that light go out into the world? Well, we have Under the Old Covenant, we have the book of the Old Testament, which included the law, God's direction to people. On the New Testament, we're going to have the Gospels and the New Testament entirely, that is Christ explaining things more perfectly and giving us a better law. Both of these collections of writing are provided by divine inspiration, so they're not man-made, they're not man-generated. They're God-inspired for those people to record and share with us. Each of them is a light to the world as to who God is, who we are, and how we're to relate to him and to one another. Again, you don't have to agree with me. That's just what I get when I read this and study this. In verse 4, Zechariah asks of the angel, what are these things? So again, I mentioned here, like I mentioned at the open of this morning, we appreciate that Zechariah is not such a prideful man that he just assumes he knows everything. He wants things explained, and he's not afraid to ask to have them explained. I thought of this when I think of Zechariah and how much I appreciate his honesty in that respect. I don't know if any of you know people or work with people. I'm going to say I work with people. That way it doesn't imply any of you here other than possibly Tom. You know anybody you've worked with who knows it all? They don't need you to explain anything. I get a kick out of that because, like I've told you guys before, my area of work is IT. So I'm always dealing with issues with people having challenges with their computers, right? Usually it's how the program works. It's less often anymore that their computer doesn't work physically. It's how some program on it works, maybe some feature they've never learned, right? There are certain people who will just come and ask me about it. Hey, I don't know how to do this. Do you have a clue? Now, I'm not that great an expert on every application, okay? But Google's a wonderful thing. How do you do this in Excel, right? So there are people who come and ask that, but then there are other people that they'll sit there and just fight and fight and fight with an issue, and they'll not make any progress on their work because they're not getting past that issue. But they won't ask for help because they don't want you to know that they don't know it. Try to never be that person. It only holds you back in life. Holds you back spiritually too. If you're not willing to recognize that there are things you don't know and that somebody else may be able to shed light on, you're not going to get past that point in your growth as a Christian. Any questions so far on those first 4 verses? It's a quiet group this morning. I saw the water up in front of Stoke. Did y'all just not get your coffee this morning? No questions to ask? Verse 5 then. The angel responds to his question. So Zechariah has provided this detailed physical description of what he saw. And the angel then gets more specific in his question. Okay, I understand you've seen it. Do you know what it means? Do you understand the vision? Let's see, and I won't read you all the rest of that note because we just talked about it. So verse 6. The angel begins the explanation of the vision. Verses 6 and 7 provide this explanation, and as expected, the lampstands represent the light of understanding that comes from God. They're an indication that what is about to be revealed comes from God. It's not from another source. In this case, it's a message that will provide great comfort and assurance, specifically to Zerubbabel, but in general to all of the people then. Once they appreciate that Zerubbabel is getting good news, that's good news for everyone. The effort of rebuilding the temple is being led by whom? Who are 2 leaders here that we've been dealing with? Zerubbabel? Who else? Joshua, yes. So we have our administrative leader in Zerubbabel, we have our spiritual leader in Joshua. And God is telling them that this effort is going to succeed. Why would you think God would need to tell them that? Have they been terribly successful up to this point? They've made mistakes, haven't they? We talked about that's the whole reason that these prophets were initially sent to them, is that they started the effort, they got convinced to stop, they've let it sit for over 10 years now, and God sends them a prophet to get them back to work, right? So if you're the people, you've got to wonder, are we ever going to finish this mission? Not because it can't be done, but as a people, are we ever going to stay focused enough to get this done? Okay? So he's giving them a comforting message. It's going to happen. I want it to happen, so guess what? It's going to happen. You're going to make it happen. But he points out that they're not going to succeed because of the things they might expect. It's not because of man's might, right? So it's not the collective determination of the people or their physical prowess that's going to make this happen, that they're going to succeed in building the temple. That's not why. It's not the strength of an individual that's going to make it happen. Zerubbabel can't do this on his own. Joshua can't do this on his own. There's not a character that we meet in this that is unique and has incredible abilities and strength, right, that can make this happen on its own. It needs the collective effort. But on the other hand, there is a good reason it's going to succeed, and that's God's power. It's what he wills to be done. If we have to think about how they've already seen evidence of this, do you think they are permitted to leave Persia and return to Jerusalem if God doesn't move the king to make that happen? You know, if God never moves Cyrus to say they can go back, do they ever go back and build the temple? Of course not. How about when they've been stopped and God moves the Persian king again to give them permission to resume the work? How about providing them two good leaders in Zerubbabel and Joshua? Do you think that they're ever going to succeed at this if there is no good leadership? Now, I'm not talking perfect leadership, because obviously we saw some gaps in there. But what did God provide then when those gaps appeared? Prophets. I've got messages for you. I've got encouragement for you. And I've got a reminder for you about why exactly you came back here in the first place. Let's get to it. He speaks of a great mountain. He says, who are you, O great mountain? And that before Zerubbabel, you shall become a plain. We can look at this in different ways. I can apply to virtually any challenges we face in life, right? They can seem like a mountain to us. Zerubbabel certainly had a lot to deal with. You've got a lot of people who are looking up to you, looking for leadership. You've got a lot of people living around you who don't like you and your people and are doing their best to make things rough for you. Probably got some self-doubts in that, well, we had this good start and then things really seem to go south. Am I a failure as a leader because I let that happen? Right? So you got all these issues. If you're Zerubbabel, they can seem like a mountain. But God says, there's nothing, there is no challenge that you can't accomplish if it's my will. When we studied Haggai chapter 2, we discussed that many people may have become discouraged, fearing that they may not succeed in rebuilding the temple because of the history that they had gone through here recently, right? But God assures them that the work will be completed, and he promises that this top stone, so when they finish off the temple, the top stone is going to be the last stone to be placed. And he says, you're going to see that top stone placed, and the reaction of you all is going to be grace to it. You're going to rejoice to see the success of your efforts here. I think there's another interesting aspect here. God's not only promising that they'll succeed in rebuilding the temple, but he's promising that at least Zerubbabel will live to see it. So this isn't something that's going to happen 100 years from now. I promise, within the next 100 years you'll build a temple. You're going to finish this temple while Zerubbabel's still around to place that top stone and for you all to see it and rejoice at it. And that is exactly what's going to happen if you haven't read the history. All right. Verses 8 and 9, and I think 10. Yes. 8, 9, and 10 I put together. Further explanation of the vision. So Zerubbabel has been president of the leader since the beginning of the efforts to return and rebuild the temple. In Haggai chapter 1, we encountered God stirring up Zerubbabel and Joshua and the people to resume their work by sending Haggai to them. God assures them that Zerubbabel will still be present and active when the temple is completed, and given their previous start with a long interruption, that's got to be reassuring. This should remove any doubt for them as to whether or not they will live to see the temple completed. What is the true test? So we talked about when we started this study that we use the word prophet, and we have different ideas of what that means. So oftentimes we think of a modern day prophet as someone who predicts things that are going to happen. And whether they come true or not is more happenstance than the prophet really knowing what's going to happen. Our three prophets we look at here aren't as much about that as they are about being teachers and encouragers and those who deliver a message on behalf of God. Zechariah is the exception here because of the foretelling of things that we see through his messages, right? But what's the true test then of those predictions? And that is their fulfillment. And God is saying, not only am I making a promise, not only will it be fulfilled, but you will live to see it fulfilled. You will know that I'm speaking the truth because you will see it come to pass yourselves. Moves on to talking about despising the day of small things. This could apply in more than one way to the people around Zechariah at this time. If you read Ezra, he records a lot of the history of the return, things that happened early on, including the reaction of those who had seen the original temple. So we talked about the fact that among those who returned were some older members who had lived in the days when the original temple stood before it was destroyed. And what was their reaction? Do you remember what their reaction was when they saw the foundation stones laid for the new temple? They cried. Do you remember why? So we talked about there were two groups that cried when this happened. One group was those who had seen the original temple, and the other group was those who had never seen the original temple, and both groups cried, but for very different reasons, right? Do you remember why those cried who had seen the original temple? Exactly. This one was going to be smaller, less ornate. It wasn't going to be everything laid over in gold like the original, right? And their reason for crying was their perception that it was less than the original. Again, then we talked about at the time that the temple has nothing to do about being ornate or impressive to other people. It was to be the presence of God and their interaction with him. So, in that sense, we look back with hindsight or looking from outside the situation and say, well, that's a shame that was your attitude, that it was about how pretty and big the temple was. So the second group cried. Why did they cry, Sarah? Exactly. Here's a group of people who are thrilled to death. They're brought to tears by joy at the idea that there will be a temple. God will be present among them again. They have only lived during a time of captivity and have never known that kind of presence with God. And they are overjoyed and moved to tears at the idea that this temple is going to come to be and we are going to have a right relationship with God again. So, One way of looking at it is this small thing being the temple. The other way of looking at it is the perspective of the people who were around them, right? When they came back, was everybody just, oh, hey, welcome back, glad you're here? Of course not. They're like, well, we don't want these people around here. They're taking up land that we could use. They seem to have the ear of the king. He let them come back. He gave them money to make this happen. He gave them resources. This isn't good for us. What was the relationship size-wise to this returning group to all those people around them? They were much smaller, right? So that's got to be a little intimidating. You got a lot of neighbors around you who don't like you, and they're bigger than you in terms of force. If we look at what's going on in the world today, has that really changed for Israel when we come right down to it? You've got a relatively small group of people surrounded by a whole lot of people who don't like them. The idea here is that those people around them considered them a small thing, something to be despised, not respected. But they'd failed to account for the most important factor of that particular group of people. Not true today, but it's true in this time, that they were God's chosen people. And no matter how large or how small their force was, when God is on their side, you're not going to defeat them. Those are the returnees who rejoice when they see the temple, or actually all of these people are going to rejoice when they see this new temple completed. So I have a note here. When it comes to studying from Old Testament, sometimes we think it's just reading about history. But the reality is that all Scripture is for our benefit, right? So what can we take from, as we read this account, what can we take for ourselves that applies to us just as equally today? So my question to you is, I don't want any raising hands. You don't need to say yes, no, or anything else. But ask yourself, do you sometimes despise the small things today? And by that I mean the opportunities that God places before you to do service. I'm not implying this is true of anyone in this room, okay? But do you know people who pass up what we would think of as small opportunities to serve others because they're looking for the big thing, right? I want to do the big thing that people see. I want to do the big thing God will see. Mostly they want to do the big thing that other people will see and tell them, well, you're such a great person for doing that, right? They want the accolades, they want the recognition that come with doing those things. And yet all those little things, all those small opportunities that God places before us, that if we do them, odds are nobody else will ever know about, are just as important to God. Do we despise the little things? If we do, that's something we need to start examining ourselves about and work on changing that. Embrace the small opportunities. Because guess what? The better you get at the little opportunities, the better you'll get at the medium-sized opportunities and the big opportunities. They won't be intimidating. They won't be things you'll be afraid to take on, because you'll begin to understand that all those things that you do in God's service, God's going to bless. We're back to our favorite number. How many lamps are on this lampstand? 7. How many eyes did we have on the stone last week? 7. We've talked about how 7 being a consideration of a perfect number, right, in Jewish belief. So these 7 are the 7, meaning the 7 lamps, are the light of God's word. They serve as witness and testimony both of him and for him. And I wrote down what I considered an interesting observation. So y'all might think, hey, boy, you find odd things interesting. It's from Matthew Henry's commentary on this. And he points out that Zerubbabel here can be seen as a type of the Christ to come. In terms of their relationship with Zerubbabel, he establishes or starts the symbol of their faith, the temple. He's instrumental in its start, right? But he's also going to be the one that we're promised here will finish that symbolic representation, right? He's going to place the top stone, and they'll all rejoice. So he begins it and finishes it, this symbol of their faith with God. Christ will author or establish the faith of the new covenant through his ministry and through the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. But he will also finish that faith, perfect it, right? So it begins, but he perfects it through his sacrifice. Would our faith, would our following Christ have any benefit if it weren't for his sacrifice and him making it possible for each of us to be redeemed before God? It wouldn't have any real benefit, would it? I think of how many times Roger has said, we don't necessarily celebrate Christ's death on the cross, we celebrate his resurrection. Because if it weren't for the resurrection, the death would be meaningless, right? His resurrection is overcoming death, overcoming Satan. If he just died and that was the end of the story, that would be the end of the story. It's his resurrection that makes that whole story so important to us. Oh, we may finish a chapter again. 2 weeks in a row. What a concept. Anybody have a question or comment before we move on? I have verses 11 and 12 together. So one aspect of this vision hasn't been explained yet by the angel. And Zechariah is really curious. He's not going to let this go. I really need to understand what's going on here. So he asks the question twice. What is the meaning of the 2 olive trees? And he phrases it slightly different each time. So I wrote a note here that said maybe the second phrasing of the question was to make clear what he felt really stood out about this vision, and yet he felt like he needed an explanation for. Okay? That was the branches of these trees, which would have clusters of olives, appeared to be directly supplying the oil into the bowls at the top that was feeding all of the lamps. He's convinced there's something significant about that, and he really wants an explanation. He's not willing to guess at it. He's not willing to assume that I'm smart enough I can figure that out. He really wants the angel to explain flat out to him, what does this mean? (13 and 14). So Zechariah, the angel questions Zechariah, do you really not understand all of this? Zechariah probably has a thought going through his head what it means, but as we keep talking about, he's not willing to just assume that he's right. He wants an explanation. It reminded me of a character. So reading of him reminds me of a character we encounter in the New Testament in Acts chapter 8. You know who I'm going to? Jordan probably knows. No? Acts chapter 8 is where we encounter the Ethiopian nobleman or eunuch, depending on what translation you read. This is what was recorded in verses 30 and 31 there. So Philip ran to him and heard him reading Isaiah the prophet and asked, do you understand what you are reading? And he said, how can I unless someone guides me? And he invited Philip to come up and sit with him. Another person we should commend for not being prideful, right? He was reading Isaiah. He probably had an idea of what was being talked about there, but he didn't understand the full application. Right? He only understood it from the perspective that maybe of Isaiah's time. And if he wasn't familiar with Christ and who he was, he may have no idea that this is what it really was pointing to, this Messiah, and that Jesus had fulfilled that coming Messiah. So here we have Zechariah asking for the explanation. And he's told, these are the two anointed ones. We touched on this in verse 3 and the different interpretations that we talked about. And to me, I felt like there was very similar symbology that we're going to find in Revelation 11, verses 3 and 4, where we're told, and I will grant authority to my two witnesses, and they will prophesy for 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth. These are the two olive trees and the two lampstands that stand before the Lord of the earth. So again, I go back to, this helped to convince me that the idea here is the two revelations that God gives to us. And you can have a very different opinion on what they mean, that's fine. But to me, I came away believing these are the two revelations God gives to us, the Mosaic dispensation and the Christian dispensation. He revealed himself very clearly in each of those cases, once through the law and the prophets, secondly, through the New Testament, of who he is, who we are, and that relationship we have to him and one another, right? And so in big, bold letters, my last note for this particular verse is, no one in mankind has any excuse for claiming ignorance about what God wants of us. If you lived in the time of Moses through coming of Christ, you had the Mosaic law and all of the books of the prophets and other writings to guide you in exactly who God was and what he expected of you. If you grew up in a time after Christ's ministry began and the church was established, and then the Holy Spirit inspired men to write things we have collected today as the New Testament, then you have the inspired word that, again, further reveals the relationship that God wants to you, wants us to have to one another, and wants us to have to him. Nobody can claim that that information was never made available to them. Now, what you choose to do with it's a whole other question. We know plenty of people who don't want to hear what we have to share with them, right? Because it interferes with their wants. I want to do these things over here that Satan tempts me with. They look fun. And if I become a Christian, then I really shouldn't do those things anymore. That'd really cramp my style. So I don't really want to hear what you have to tell me. You'll just make me feel bad. Right? People of Zechariah's day had the same kind of instruction. You could read it, you could understand it. It was your choice whether you wanted to have that shared with you or not. Well, we already heard the first bell. We've only got a couple of minutes, so we won't read the next chapter, I don't think. Actually, I guess we have enough time. We'll read it. That way you can read it again on your own in your own translation before we gather again next week. Chapter 5. We have two visions presented to us here. Again, I lifted my eyes and saw, behold, a flying scroll. And he said to me, what do you see? I answered, I see a flying scroll. Its length is 20 cubits, its width 10 cubits. Then he said to me, this is the curse that goes out over the face of the whole land. For everyone who steals should be cleaned out according to what is on one side, and everyone who swears falsely should be cleaned out according to what is on the other side. I will send it out, declares the Lord of hosts, and it shall enter the houses of the thief and the house of him who swears falsely by my name, and it shall remain in his house and consume it, both timber and stones. Then the angel who talked with me came forward and said to me, lift your eyes and see what is going, Lift your eyes and see what this is that is going out. And I said, what is it? He said, this is the basket that is going out. And he said, this is their iniquity in all the land. And behold, the leaden cover was lifted, and there was a woman sitting in the basket. And he said, this is wickedness. And he thrust her back into the basket and thrust down the leaden weight upon its opening. Then I lifted up my eyes and saw, behold, two women coming forward. The wind was in their wings. They had wings like the wings of a stork, and they lifted up the basket between earth and heaven. Then I said to the angel who talked with me, "Where are they taking the basket?" He said to me, "To the land of Shinar, to build a house for it. And when this is prepared, they will set the basket down there on its base." So that is chapter 5. I encourage you to reread that before next week. So we will study that. I'm sure he's getting ready to go up and go ring that bell. Does anybody have anything they want to share before he gets there? All right, thank you.